it's translation of poetry and poetical translation. This is not what you will do most of the time in your careers. The majority of translations out there are technical translations, translation in the medical domain, automotive domain. That's where the core of the profession is. But the area of poetical translation has been traditionally regarded as a very high intellectual endeavor, as very intellectually stimulating area, and lots of people were just writing about it, despite the fact that mostly poetical translation is done by a minority of translators, but the type of challenge they face is by order of magnitude greater than the other types of translation. So it is interesting from a research perspective, it's interesting intellectually, and that's why we are talking about this. And in some way, there are some principles which may enrich your experience as translators, which will help you to become better translators in general, and maybe sometimes you will also be translating poetical text. These slides don't go with Jacob Blexley, who is now visiting professor in Italy, University of Bologna, and he prepared most of the slides. I introduced some of my own slides, and at some point I may show you some other interesting things that might be relevant for our talk today from my experience with poetical translation. I didn't translate poetry myself, but the background which we have here allows us to talk a little bit about this type of very challenging artistic type of translation. Okay, so the outline. First, we need to understand what is poetry and how we define poetry, why it is difficult for translation, why it is different from other types of texts. Firstly, artistic texts such as prose, and secondly, the texts which are not don't have this aesthetic dimension, don't have this literary component in it. And we'll talk about, if we have time, about some specific types of translation, theories of translations, what is translatable, what is not translatable, what are the strategies used by translators to address this issue, and some specific cultural paradigms in literature and how they were translated by different generations into the modern world. So this is the plan. At some point we also will talk about English writers, and especially the writers which wrote long before the advent of English language as we know it today. Shakespeare is sometimes difficult to read, especially for those whose native language is not English, but he is the most modern of all the authors in this list. And the point is that sometimes you need translation from English into English. You need translation from the old language, the language of these authors, into more modern version, and new generations somehow lost the link with the previous authors. And translation is filling this gap even if there is no language barrier, if the language is essentially the same or bears the same name. So this is the plan. Okay, so let's think about what is poetry, how we will define poetry. And just you can carry out this experiment yourself. Ask different groups of people, different types of your population in your experiment, how they define poetry. So ask a nursery child, a school child, a student, ask a professor in history or literature, and you can ask a poet what is poetry. You will definitely get different answers. So what you would expect from a nursery child, for example, what they would say to you defining poetry. Something that rhymes. I would say that it maybe a school child would say that rhymes. So a nursery child would say maybe it's kind of written in a funny way. It's written in these lines, so the lines are broken into shorter pieces compared to stories which they read in storybooks or which their parents read to them. So for nursery child, it would be kind of this visual dimension. So it's dimension of breaking things into some co-measured pieces. Yeah. For school child, yes, you are right. It's something which rhymes. They start to realize that this is there is this dimension of organization in the verse, which comes on top of other dimensions of organization. So they may not realize, but they already speak in sentences. Sentences contain verbs, sentences as coherent way of expressing a thought. But in poetry, you have this additional dimension which is organizing the poetry, and the rhyme is obviously one of the things. So what would you get if you ask a student about poetry definitions? What they would say? Those of you who studied.
Piece of literature which follows determined rules of syntax, sentence structure, like double syllables and syllables.
Exactly, yeah. So it follows some meter. So it's called meter. So it's the students are now aware that apart from rhyming, so rhyming is not sufficient. You have this commensurate structure in the sentence, which is another level of organization, where the stress, for example, is somehow occurs in regular patterns. There is some rhythm to the poetry. There is reappearing of stressed and unstressed syllables, and this is called meter. So in literary theory. So and there may or may not be rhyme, but there may be something which organizes the verse. But this is not necessarily stress. In Latin poetry, in Roman poetry, something else was used apart from stress. So it wasn't stress, but it was anyone studied Latin poetry. So it was kind of the alternation of long and short syllables. So what we carry out now as stress syllable in their understanding was a long syllable with a long vowel, and so, but exactly as you say, it was alternation of these patterns. So there is some rhythmic organization in the verse. Yeah. So what would literary professors say to you? So in this experience.
Read the syllabus.
Sorry?
Read the syllabus.
Read the syllabus.
Yeah, that's what teachers always say.
Yeah. So read and find out. So well, if you read the literature, so what they say, usually we'll see some examples, but they say that there is kind of some psychological dimension to it. There is a perception of poetry in some aesthetic sense. So it carries some psychological baggage, some impact on the reader, and it may be cultural phenomenon. It can be relative to the cultures, what is regarded as poetry and what is not regarded as poetry. So that's the typical answer which you are getting from these content-based literary studies. And what would happen if you ask poets?
Art.
Sorry?
It's art.
Art, yeah. Well, they will give you a lot of contradictory answers. So Edgar Allan Poe said, I will define and read the poetry of words as the rhythmical creation of beauty. Wordsworth. I have said that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Yeah? Then maybe you better compare it with Eliot's statement. Poetry is not turning loose on emotions, but an escape from emotions. So completely contradictory. It is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality. And you can read for yourself other poetic definitions. So here you have maybe some deeper understanding of what poetry is, what poetry means for people, what poetry, how poetry functions in society, how poetry works in the relation to personal experience of the readers, of the writers of poetry, of the translators of poetry. But the problem here is that the statements, the definitions, are somehow contradictory and not very scientific, maybe not very systematic. Maybe we lose something if we go into this scientific definition of poetry, and these definitions together give us more richness, give us more experience, but sometimes there are limitations to this type of exploration of the world in aesthetic dimensions compared to some more rigorous scientific or research or scholarly dimension. So we should be a bit careful about these definitions. So how we should define poetry, and how we can differentiate poetry from other things in our experience. So this is our question. Firstly, why poetry, how it's different from prose? So what is poetry is not prose. Yeah, so can we tell how poetry is different, why it's not prose? So, well, it has exactly these features. It has rhythm, it has rhyme maybe. So what about rhyming? Look in this poem, turning, and winding fire, the falcon's cannot hear the falconer. So is there rhyme here? No, rhyme is not here. So actually the school child was not right. So it was wrong. So you can. So anyone knows who the author is? Yeats, and it's the beginning of the century, Irish poet, and he wrote during the time which resembles our times very much, and his poem kind of becomes reappearing and becomes very actual, so as if it is coming from Donald Trump's era. So the best lack all conventions, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. So a very modern poem, despite being written 100 years ago, yeah, but it doesn't have any rhyming. So what it has, maybe it has some rhythm, it has some pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables, yeah, and still people write like that in modern days. So you cannot tell which century it was written by just looking into this poem, but the poems don't have to have rhymes to be poems, so it is something that does not distinguish poetry from prose. Yeah. What about other dimension? What about rhythm? Does it have to have rhythm? Anyone knows any poems which don't have rhythm?
Is rhythm something that the reader puts on the poem, or is it something that's inherent to the poem? Is rhythm, is that something that the reader puts onto the poem, or is it something that the writer of the poem has tried to incorporate themselves?
Yeah, that's a very good question. No, it is the objective feature of the poem. It's the property of the poem, because you can discover the rhythm. There are different types of rhythms. There is catalog, and you have 2-syllable patterns, 3-syllable patterns, 4-syllable patterns, alternation of patterns. So there is a science of this poetic metric, and rhythm is objective. So it's when the writer usually if any of you are writing a poems, so it is very often words come last. The first comes the rhythm, the music. So usually you may have it's more easier to write a poem on existing music than to write music for existing poem. So it is usually works from the rhythm, from the pattern to the poetry, rather than the other way around. Yes, so it is the sense comes last here. So yeah, it is objective. So, but does it have to have? Anyone knows any types of verses which don't have rhythm? So if you study literary theory, so the verses which don't have rhyme but have rhythm are called blank verse. But there is also the type of verse which has developed in France, and the name is vers libre, or free verse, and they don't have to have rhythm. They can dispense with rhythm. Here is an example. But patience is more oft the exercise of saints, the trial of their fortitude, making them each his own deliverer and victor of all that tyranny or fortune can inflict. It's kind of, there are some rudimentary maybe elements of rhythm, but that pattern is broken in some cases, especially with the shorter line here. This is John Milton, very, anyone was able to find, did you find any written? There are some attempts, yeah, but no recurring pattern. But this wasn't only written in the 17th century. This is a more modern author. She is an American author, and this is actually the way she wrote the poem. Once a snowflake fell on my brow, and I loved it so much that I kissed it, and it was happy, and called his cousins and brothers and the web, and so on. So very hard to find any rhythmical pattern, any solidification pattern. So we're in trouble. So the idea of a student is also a little bit problematic here. So what we are left with? Where is the boundary between poetry and prose? What makes the poetry poetic and what makes the prose prosaic? Something which you will get from literary professor now. This is literary professor Tomaszewski, 1928, and they say, yeah, you cannot define poetry. It is impossible to give a precise objective definition of verse, impossible to know fundamental features separating verse from prose. So he just basically gave up. The feature of versification arises not only out of objective characteristics, your question of objective features of poetry, but also of the artistic perception. So it's kind of down to people who perceive it. And it's stylistically a judgment. So it's up to us to judge whether we see it as poetry or whether we don't perceive it as poetry. But that's kind of the answer which is given. So if you read it as poetry, it is poetry in the literal sense. But you just let's not give up, because to every literary professor with one opinion, there are 10 other literary professors with other opinions, and people did not agree with this definition. And just our small experiment, the cat was sitting on the mat, a little mouse by his side. What is the matter with the cat? He's too lazy and too fat. And this is the kind of something which is you will judge as poetry. This is something which is not a poetry. So basically, you will immediately tell where it is prose and where it is poetry. So this kind of very deliberate question of whether you should perceive it as poetry is maybe a little bit misguided. And there should be some features and some characteristic of the poetic text. Yeah. So how can we find it and how we can identify it? Maybe anyone has an idea. Who is right? The nursery child, the school child, the student, or the professors?
I think one of the differences is that with poetry you don't necessarily need to have a storyline or a message or anything, not necessarily. You can have it, but it can also be very much out of your own interpretation.
Yeah, so the poem with the storyline is called a ballad, yeah, so there is a plot there, but usually it's lyrics which express some feeling rather than the plot, rather than the storyline, rather than the objective things, but the poem may express storyline here. So here, but here I think you notice one thing in this example where you don't have to be explicit very much in poetry. Sometimes you derive meanings from some spots of thought. So you have like mosaic, and then you connect the dots much more fluently in poetry, and you have to insert these linking words in prose. So the way you write the prose is different from the way you write poetry. So maybe that's also the observation which is related to the situation. Yeah. Well, there was a school of thought which were formalists like Roman Jakobson and Gasparov, Mikhail Gasparov in Russian tradition. They said actually that the nursery child was right. So the only definition, the only thing that distinguishes poetry from non-poetry, it's lineation. So it's basically what the child said, that it's kind of broken down in lines. And if we take different definitions, so we can see there were chronological definitions, so how poetry was working in classical Greek and Latin, then in European tradition, in Chinese tradition, Japanese tradition, all they look different. But trying to bring them together and trying to come up with the logical definition is that there the form is functional. It's not only relevant what is written, but how it is written. So the aesthetic meanings and sometimes the content meaning are carried also by these additional levels of organizations, like rhyme, like rhythm, like breaking to these lines. And Gasparov said that a verse is speech measured out in relatively short units, so it should be observable, it shouldn't go on and on. Each of which correlates with other units and is commensurable with them. So when we see the poetry, when we read the poetry, or hear the poetry, we hear these breaks, we hear these commensurable lines, and they relate to each other in a way in which sentences don't relate to each other. And this lineation means that we segment poetry, we break it down into chunks in a different way as we break down the normal speech, as we break down sentences. So we work on top of semantic splitting, semantic segmentation of the speech. On top of that, we have an additional level of author segmentation, and they don't go together. They can, so you can have a poetical break, a line break, where there is no meaning break, where there is no break in pause, or break in semantic group, or break in a phrase there. Let's see whether it works or not. A snowflake fell on my brow and I loved. Yeah, so this is not a natural break. Loved it. Yeah, so it should be here. So it would break normally. Yeah. And I kissed it. So it and it. So you see that this organization of it goes into the front, and this way of breaking is essentially the poet's contribution. So they are not guided by the language structure. They introduce their own splitting, and this splitting carries additional level of information, additional meaning. So this is what works here. And the same works, you will see price difference all around. So the same works here. So victor over all that tyranny of fortune can inflict. Okay? Again, semantic break doesn't correspond to the break in poetical distribution of lines. And these lines are commensurable. So these formalisms, formalists, so their point is that the distinguishing feature of poetry is basically this breaking lines in some creative way, which is comes on top of semantic breaks. So it works. So I challenge you to find any counterexample to this, anything which doesn't correspond to this definition of poetry, but this is, in my view, the only meaningful definition which we can have. Yeah? Okay, so now second part. Can we translate poetry? Dante was basically very much against translating poetry. He said that everyone should know that nothing harmonized according to the rules of poetry can be translated from the native tongue. So, and basically any translation of poetry incurs inevitable loss. So you cannot translate poetry according to. There were some people who disagreed, and John Dryden said no man is capable of translating a poetry besides the genius, or to that out. It's not a master both of his author's language and his own. So the translator should be very proficient, should be poet herself, and should recreate the poetic work in their own culture according to some concepts of that culture. So this is the principles of translatability, which is basically not very good news for those who are not poets themselves. I mean, they will never be able to translate poetry, according to Dryden. Let's see whether we can challenge that opinion. Percy P.C. Shelley said, "It were as wise to cast a violet into a crucible that you might discover the formal principle of its color and order." So he compares it to this situation that you can discover color and order by placing something into a crucible. And the same is to seek to transfuse from one language into another the creation of a poet. So the way forward is that the plant must grow from its roots, so it should grow very naturally, and what the original provides is only a seed, but that seed needs to grow in the target culture. So that's a very powerful image, but that's how it works according to Shelley. There was also conception of Robert Browning: "I should require him to be literal at every cost, save the absolute violence of our language." So this is another approach. So it's approach based not on being faithful to the target culture, but being faithful to the original. So this is, again, that very famous debate in translation studies between source-oriented versus target-oriented. But here it said that poets should be faithful to the original and maybe sacrifice the beauty of the target. So let's see how it works. Then Ezra Pound went a bit further than that, distinguishing three types of poetry. So if you are taking literary courses in literature, so sometimes you talk about philosophical poetry, imagery poetry, and some phonetic poetry. So this is basically stems from this research. So he distinguishes melopedia, wherein the words are charged over and above their plain meaning with some musical property, so some phonetic dimension. Then we have Phanepedia, which is a casting of images of the visual imagination, and Logopedia, which is the dance of intellect among words, so it's like philosophical poetry. And this is more about images, this is more about the beauty of sound. And the point is that only Phanepedia can be translated, but other two parts are untranslatable. Again, in Logopedia I would disagree, because you can translate philosophy, so then you can translate philosophical poetry, but you will lose something of the aesthetic dimension of it. Paul Valery said, "Where poetry is concerned, fidelity to the meaning alone is betrayed." So you lose something in the meaning. So again, let's carry out some very dumb experiment with the poetry. And there was this translation of a limerick. I think some of you are familiar with this genre. There was a young man who was bitten by 22 cats and a kitten. Right, it is clear, my end is quite near, no matter I'll die like a virgin. Like children's rhyme, but then we get a translation into Ukrainian. This is a back translation. A young man, they bit a young man, 7 cats and 3 little kittens. "I will die," he cries, "oh sweet moment, as the rich can die." So basically, when you are taking your translation classes, the first rule is that the numbers should be translated correctly, should be translated faithfully. Yeah? So is this translation wrong, that 22 cats became 7 cats? And 1 kitten became indefinite number of kittens. So there are some other meanings. So basically here the rules of classical translation are broken down because different levels of information become more important. Any translation is a loss. You lose everything, you lose something if you're translating technical texts. But in technical texts, the numbers are the most crucial, the most relevant, the most important thing, and priority to be translated. Here they are not priority. Here are some aesthetic, rhythmical dimensions of priority. So you simply shift here. So translation of poetry is not very much different from translation of technical texts. You simply shift the dimensions, the levels of information which are relevant, be translated. So according to this formalistic approach. So, and here you are allowed to translate 22 as 7 here, but what is interesting, that you need to preserve the rhyme, the aesthetic value, maybe, so the impact of the poetry on the reader, on the perceiver of the poetry. So Jefferson said that poetry is by definition untranslatable, only creative transposition is possible for the translation. Then, to what extent we can apply these creative transpositions? So if we want to preserve this metrical structure, metrical rhythm, we are putting ourselves in a very restricted framework. So you can, for example, 3-syllable meters, 3-syllable meter, you can translate with a 3-syllable meter in the target language. This still is possible, but this is not really happening very often. So you very often change even the rhythm, you simply introduce as a compensation a different rhythm. So, and you overcome these limitations, but you do not have even to preserve the same formal organization of the poetical text. So what you need to preserve is a big question. This is a very interesting approach taken by Vladimir Nabokov when he translated Eugene Onegin into English, and it's completely unreadable if you try to read it in English. So he tried to be very faithful to the original. He sacrificed completeness of meaning, every formal element, including this iambic rhythm. Iambic is, I think, syllable, two-syllable meter with syllable on the second syllable. So he did translate as this, but he still wanted to preserve fidelity, preserve the meaning, and this is kind of was the result of his strategy. So it's a poetical translation which is good for academics, good for those who are doing research on Eugene Onegin, but for aesthetic impact, for reading for pleasure, it completely doesn't work. So you have different translations for different purposes. And Pushkin is kind of well known for the beauty of his rhythm, the beauty of his effect on the audience, and he simply gave up on that dimension of information. So there are, according to Lefebvre, several ways how the poetry can be translated. So you can translate it as mimetic translation, preserve the same formal similarity. You can do analogical translations, produce something which is functional equivalent. Organic translation, I think, is very much state-of-the-art, is content derivative, but also introduces some meters, some formal features into it. You can have phonemic translation, reproducing sound, or you can translate poetry as prose, and you can introduce some imitations or adaptations to poetry. And each has its own advantages, disadvantages, strategies, and so on. So in mimetic translation, so the translation written in the same formally similar meter. So it's criticized as very strict, very rigorous, and you can rarely find them, these examples. But it preserves the feeling of the rhythm for you. Again, people do not value this very much. Meters in verse are kind of spiritual magnitudes for which nothing can be substituted. They cannot be replaced by each other, and especially not by free verse. So there is even some value in this mimetic translation. There are some examples, especially if you translate one specific genre of poetry, like sonnets. Sonnets have very particular organization. They are 11-syllable verses, typically in English, and they have the structure of these lines. So you have quatrains, which is 4 lines, 2 quatrains, and then 2 tercets, 2 groups of lines, groups of 3 lines. And then you can translate Italian sonnets into this rhythm, and they will be different from English sonnets, which have different types of organizations of of these lines, different types of distribution of the lines, of these 14 lines. So this is kind of the way how you follow these mimetic principles. With analogical translation, you use some functional equivalent. If some rhythm, some pattern is more approachable, more famous in the target culture, you use that. So you do not foreignize the rhythmic structure. So instead of translating something which was very ancient in Roman times, you translate it into English, which is kind of more common, more known, and that would be the effect which Petrarca's work would have on its source audience. Yeah. Organic translation is where form and content are inseparable. So the form doesn't predetermine the content. So you first focus on the translation of content, and then you are free to choose any form you want. So, and this is how most of poetry is translated now. And this is an example of translating a 4-verse poem. It's not 4-verse anymore in English, but it preserves the meaning and it preserves some effect on a very broad scale, some reminiscence of what would work in the source culture, and a similar effect, but not the same, is preserved in the target culture. So this is organic translation. Organic translation is often contrasted with interlinears. Interlinears are very interesting form of poetry translation, where you simply give up on attempting to translate it in this organic way, in the way that preserves some melody, so it's basically attempt maybe to translate it with a prose. So an example is so this Ukrainian. If you are following football, so there is a famous Ukrainian football player Andriy Shevchenko. This is another guy, so it's also Shevchenko, but he lived much earlier. And apparently in Ukraine, this guy is much more famous than the other guy. But he wrote quite a lot and defined like modern Ukrainian poetical discourse. And John Weir translated his poem, I think, in the 20th century already, as with stark injustice all around, the shackled people silent wait, while on the apostolic throne there sits a petted monk in state. The wholesale trades in human blood and rents our heaven for the price. So this is his organic translation. And this guy is kind of more modern translator, more contemporary, and he just gave up on attempts to translate it as poetry. He could read the original text and understand it very deeply, and his translation is all around no truth, no freedom, as nation suffers in silence. On the papal throne, a well-fed monk is sitting. He batters with blood of people, and offers heaven for a price. So which one would be fair? Which one would? John Weir's? Zibanejad's?
Both have something.
You both have something, so there are some advantages to both. The problem with John Weir's translation, so even though it's kind of very rhythmical, it reads like poetry, and this is basically interlinear, what you will get if, kind of as first stage. Very often translators who don't know the source language, they ask people to produce this interlinear and then transform it into poetical text. So this interlinear, but it has value in its own. It can be read as poetical translation. Why? Because if you look at the corpus of Shevchenko's poetry, he never used the word injustice. Injustice is kind of non-existent. And it's kind of down to this fact that injustice was a very common place there, so it was like restating the obvious. The courts in Russian Empire, that they did not function at all, so they were not institutes of justice. Maybe they are not institutes of justice even now, but it's kind of another story. But he did not argue about justice. So if you look into his other poems, so this kind of key concept for him was freedom. So the freedom was the defining feature, and here is completely lost in translation. So it's sacrifice, and this very important component of poetical discourse, which is sacrifice. And that's kind of the advantage of interlinear, that you give up of poetical niceties, but you get this philosophy right, the drive right. So how do we know which concept, so we kind of can compare it to other Shevchenko's poems, and this time John Deere's translation kind of faithfully reflects what it is. So Shevchenko, the same year, he was very ill and he wrote Testament. He lived after that, I think, for for several decades after that, but he wrote his Testament, but he was feeling he was about to die. And it's a very beautiful first 4 lines. When I am dead, then bury me in my beloved Ukraine, my thumb upon a grave mount high, and make the splendid plain, so that fields the boundless steppes, the Dnieper's plunging shore, my eyes could see, my ears could hear, the mighty river, also very rustic, very beautiful. So, and then he strikes you on your head. When from Ukraine the Dnieper bears into the deep blue sea the blood of foes, then I will leave these hills and fertile fields. I'll leave them all and fly away to the abode of God, and then I'll pray, but till that day I nothing know of God. Oh, bury me and rise you up and break your heavy chains and water with the tyrant's blood the freedom you have gained. So it's kind of very violent, calling for political violence, not at all adept of justice. Justice is kind of not the framework he was operating in. So he was not moaning, he was not calling for justice. He was actually calling people to take power into their hands and to react. And then he concludes, and in the great new family, or the family of the free, with softly spoken kindly words, remember also me. So he somehow transforms this conception so he was at that time dreaming what people are now in Ukraine believe to be kind of this analog of European Union. So then join the European Union, guys, after you defeat these Tsarists and imperial Russian imperialists. So then do it. So it's kind of becomes very contemporary now, but justice was not the thing that he was appealing to. Basically, knowing that, you would prefer this interlinear translation. I think we are running out of time, and there are some interesting aspects of prose translation. Sometimes the translation can be translated as prose. Phonemic translation, if some of you can read the Latin, so you may see that in Latin, some in Middle Ages, the C before I was written by, was read as S, and in classical Latin it was written as K. And when translation was done, so it was kind of according to this classical tradition, so classical pronunciation. But here the sounding of the verse is reflected rather than translation of the meaning. So the focus is very much on the form of translation. So I just encourage you to read the other slides when you have time. We don't have much time for this. I just also will point out that on the DLE you have another set of slides for it was a talk at one of the conferences of sociology of poetry, and this is there is one example where the poem of 1971 was retranslated into modern discourse and became gained new meanings because of the recent events which happened not long ago, for example, on Independence Square, and from lyrical poetry, from something which reflected the personal grief of the poet. So his son died just shortly before, and he wrote this poem. So transforming his personal grief into national grief, so to grief for those who were killed in fight for freedom and so on. So this was kind of very interesting way how the poetry was translating itself into the new epoch. And some people claim that each generation would need a new translation of poetical texts. Okay, so I think I will finish here, so you can find slides in the DLE. And if you have any questions, anything which you would like to ask at this stage. If not so, then please when you leave your module feedback on that table or this side of the table. Good luck with your exams, with everything, and good luck also with your essays, and I hope we'll start, we'll be able to mark them within 4 weeks as we promised everyone. So you should receive your feedback in 4 weeks. I will be a couple of minutes here, so if anyone wants to ask something. Okay, thank you.